Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video I wanted to go ahead and break down my iteration of what a Sapphire Amethyst deck might look like in set 5. If you ask me, this is one of the ink pairings that I think a lot of people wanted to be good, but was never really that meta competitive. I do think that changes with set 5. While it won't be top tier, I definitely think this deck could have some play in the metagame, and we'll discuss some of the reasons why, but you can probably already tell from what's pictured on screen here, there are a lot of cards from set 5 in this deck, and I think that's part of the reason why it makes it a little bit more competitive. So let's go ahead and break this down. Again, this is purely experimental, but from limited testing, I found that this deck works surprisingly well. There are some things that I'll cover, and I do have a gameplay video coming with this as well, so keep that in mind. So starting off, we're on 36 Amethyst cards and 25 Sapphire for a total of 61. Okay, we play 44 inkables and 17 non-inkables. The majority of what we play is characters. We play just a couple of items in 4 and 7 songs. We curve out pretty nicely in the first 4 turns, as we usually do. This is one of the things I focus on when I deck build, is you definitely want to be able to play nicely on curve at turn 4. And then come turn 5 and above, you start to craft your game plan based on the deck you're playing and the scenario that you are in. So you can see that, again, it's a pretty nice spread across the board, but let's go ahead and start breaking down why we made some of the card choices that we have. In the 1-drop slot, I went for something a little bit unorthodox in 4 of the new Cogsworth and 4 of the new Basil. And the reason for this is because traditionally when you look at what Sapphire Amethyst is, they don't really have too many forms of hard removal. They have some forms of removal, like we know Sapphire has things like Hades and Let It Go, which puts things into the inkwell. We know that Amethyst has rush cards, which can help deal immediately with exerted threats, but they don't have some of that hard removal that Steel and Ruby might have, which are some of the reasons why you've seen, Steel and Ruby decks basically been at the top of the meta for a long time in the first 4 sets. While that doesn't necessarily change with set 5, I do think you get some very nice supporting options, pun intended, with cards like Basil and Chicha. These cards serve a dual purpose. The first one is, this is a 1-drop that's inkable and is a 2/1 body. Similar to how Chernobog Followers is very solid, this card being a 2-strength character means that it will trade out into a good amount of cards. The 1 toughness doesn't really matter too much, because whether it was a 1-drop 2/2 like the standard vanillas that we get, it still gets traded out by things like Let the Storm Rage On and challenged and banished into pretty much anything anyways. But the ability to give support can come in really, really handy with Amethyst now, because this is a good value character first of all, so you're not necessarily losing something in order for a character to have support, which is what we've seen in the past. Think like Merlin from Chapter 1. It's a 4-cost card, it's inkable, but it's a 3/4 body, and it's a 3/4 body because it has support. If it was a 4/4 body with support for 4, like that would have made it not even that great, but like it would have made it more viable. So the fact that you don't get like a 1/1 character with support for 1 is actually pretty good, and this is what I think Ravensburger needs to do in order to make support viable. So why this is important is, if you drop this on turn 1, and then let's say you eventually develop something like a Mim Fox later on, and this character is still on board, or any rush character, and the one that really matters here is going to be the Elsa, the 5th Spirit. You drop the Elsa, let's say you tap down an opposing character, then you quest with your Basil, give this Elsa +2, it becomes a 4/5 body. Now the Elsa can take out pretty much anything, right, including what it exerted, and you get really good value off of stuff like that. The Chicha also serves a dual purpose in this deck. One, it's an insanely powerful draw engine. To my surprise, I didn't expect it to be as good as it was in this deck, and I changed some of the ratios from my testing and gameplay, but this card with like the Great Stone Dragon combos so insanely well, especially if your opponent can't out this, like if they're not playing Steel and don't have like Let the Storm Rage On or Strength of a Raging Fire, and you don't want to waste a Zeus on this, right? But if this can survive for a couple of turns and net you a couple of free draws, especially off of a Stone Dragon, like the amount of advantage that you gain from this is absolutely off the charts, because you're getting free ink from the Stone Dragon, and then you're also generating a card, like you go +2 every turn. Like, and when you think about the state of Lorcana, you draw a card for your turn, you play an ink, and you play an interaction, a character or something, right? So you go -1 every turn, because you only get 1 resource for the draw, and then you have to play multiple resources every turn, right? Ink and play a card. So this bypasses that whole mechanic of the game, where you draw your card for turn, you get a free ink, so therefore you don't go -1 off of inking a card. because you're inking from your discard, and then you also get an additional draw. So you draw again off Chicha, and then your ink is free. So you're +2 on the turn, and then you're able to play your interactions, right? So even if you get just a couple of those instances off, the amount of advantage you can gain from that is really, really powerful. And so because of that, going into the 2 cost, we'll go back to the Cogsworth in just a second, but I'm only opting to play 3 Mim Snake because yes, in certain scenarios you want to Mim Snake on 2 in order to bounce back your Cogsworth or Basil to protect them if they've quested. And this is just a solid body coming down on 2 anyways. But even this coming down on turn 3 or 4, you can do interactions like quest with your Cogsworth if you play this on 1, but you didn't quest with it on turn 2. Maybe you quest with it on turn 3, then you play Snake, bounce the Cogsworth back, replay Cogsworth for the last ink on turn 3. Now your Snake has Rush and it can take out a character, right? So you have like little iterations like that. It basically makes Snake a Fox, so an alternative to 3-drop. This combination of Cogsworth and Madam Mim Snake basically turn into a pseudo version of Fox. Yes, it's 1 less strength, but you essentially could have 7 copies of Fox in your deck with this interaction on 3, right? So this is solving some of the issues that this ink pairing have had in the past, in my opinion, where you just needed constant pressure in order to out opponents' threats while maintaining your board state. And as we know, Maui's the greatest example from the first chapter, these rush characters can go 2 for 1 a lot of the time, and this is where you generate even additional advantage with this ink pairing, which is why it can be very powerful, I think, in the meta. Like I said, in my testing, this deck really surprised me at how effective it was. So that's kind of the interactions you get with Cogsworth. It works with the Madam Mim Elephant, it works with the Madam Mim Snake. This card coming down can do a lot of work in the deck for sure, especially if you already have some of the support characters like Chicha or Basil on field, and let's say you drop something unassuming like a Merlin Crab, you quest with Basil, you boost up Crab, and Crab boosted up the Basil, or boosted up something else, and then you drop Cogsworth to give Crab the +2, or sorry, the rush, and then it also got the +2 from Basil. Like, there's so many unique interactions that you could use with this deck to just boost up your characters and drop unassuming threats to your opponent and out their cards, right, where they don't expect it. And that surprise factor, as we know with like characters that have rush, can be really valuable. So that's kind of some of the thought process behind this deck. Hopefully I'm making sense. If I'm not, let me know in the comment section below. But maybe if you watch the gameplay video that's going to come later, you can kind of see some of this stuff in action. But yeah, the Chicha is just really good for that as well. Yes, it is very vulnerable, it is uninkable, but having the ability to draw cards on the second ink off of something like the Tipo, which we're going to take a look at in a second, and the Great Stone Dragon, as well as having support for when you really need to quest with it and provide that support to another character, just allows this card to provide dual purpose. The Tipo, well, I don't think it's absolutely necessary. It can just help you get that little bit of extra ramp, and it is a card that if you go Basil 1, Tipo 2, now your Basil is threatening to make your Tipo a 3/2 on the next turn, which checks your opponent in terms of their questing ability, right? What's also solid is Basil on 1, Chicha on 2 also potentially introduces the threat of I have 4 strength on the Chicha on turn 3 when I can quest or challenge with the Chicha. And while you don't normally want to lose your Chicha in a challenge, the 4 strength is now going to be very relevant for, of course, the new Daisy Duck, Donald State, the aggro 1 quester. And also being on 50 characters, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but like you have a high chance of always revealing a character off of Daisy Duck, which just generates even more advantage for you if your opponent is on Amber. And of course that synergizes very well with something like the Great Stone Dragon. Traditionally, why this card hasn't been the greatest in other Sapphire decks, like Sapphire Steel, Sapphire Ruby, is simply because they don't play enough characters, right? They usually tap out at around 30-ish characters, 30 to 35, maybe even less, and you just don't get the value off of being able to ink off this every turn. Whereas in a deck like this, you're playing so many characters and so many low to the ground characters, as I mentioned, from the 1 to 4 drop, that you're able to utilize that Stone Dragon every single turn and ink for free, or double ink for free, and generate an additional card draw off Chicha. Even if your Chicha gets outed, your Great Stone Dragon just inking for you for turn if you don't need that ink available right away, because it does come in exerted, is very, very valuable as well, allowing you to keep extra resources in your hand. So, the low to the drop curve, right, from 1 to 3 is very important, because as you can see here, on 3, we don't really play that many characters, because we also are anticipating we might need to drop a Great Stone Dragon. So you just have the 4 Fox and the 2 Crab. Don't need to really explain those too much, right? Fox continues to be one of the best cards in the game, one of the best Amethyst cards in the game. Very, very strong. I've opted to use 2 elephants in this build as well, just a very solid big body that comes down, and being able to recycle some of your cards like the Cogsworth is very useful, especially if you don't have Elsa, right, which, you know, is very powerful on 5 because it also taps down, but bouncing back a Cogsworth on 5 with a Mim Elephant and then being able to drop Cogsworth to give this thing rush right away is very relevant. And especially, again, if you have Chicha or Basil on field, you quest with those, you give the Elephant +2. Now you have the Elephant that's a 5/7 body that also has rush coming down on turn 5, right? Very, very powerful. And then if this thing lives from its challenge, it's able to move 2 damage on the following turn. So just like a ton of different synergies, once again, with this build that work out pretty nicely. Also in the 4-drop slot, I was trying out the Uninkable Rush Rafiki, which is probably what's going to be used in the gameplay video. And it is good, don't get me wrong, but I just find that potentially protecting yourself against like the Prince John Mirror, where you're limited to 3 cards in hand, because this deck does want to draw a lot of cards, and then preventing you from getting your last couple of cards discarded with like You Have Forgotten Me, Sudden Chills, Lucifer, etc. A card like this comes down and can definitely help protect you against stuff like that. And this card, you know, being played as a 2-of is relevant because it can be searched out by our tutor, Merlin, Intellectual Visionary. So I don't think this is a card that you need to play like 4 copies of. I think 2 is fine because most of the time it's going to be ink. It's just in that very specific matchup you're going to end up needing to search it or keep it in hand in order to play it out and guard yourself against that further discard, because this card is very capable of drawing you 3 or 4 cards during your turn, right? And then you can obviously play out a lot of those interactions, hopefully. But yeah, this card I think is an interesting inclusion. It's still experimental, more needs to be tested. If this card isn't really that prevalent in the meta, obviously you would cut this. But again, just kind of showing you guys why we need side decks in the game. There's so many cards that could be so good in side decks that would really make a lot more decks viable, because it, you know, they're able to side in against their worst matchups. But in a best of 2 format, I don't think we'll ever get side decks. So yeah, it's kind of a weird situation that we're in. 4 goats and 4 rabbits, no need to hopefully explain those. Good shift targets for Merlin now, and even if there was no tutor Merlin, you would still be playing 4 because they're just that good. And obviously the rabbit represents another draw engine on top of the Chicha. So you have 10 different ways to bounce back rabbit, 9, because we've cut 1 snake from 4 to 3. So 9 Madam Mims in order to bounce either goats and or the rabbits in order to gain lore or draw cards. Again, you may not need it if you have the Chicha engine rolling. You can use these cards to bounce other things. It depends, again, on the scenario that you've set yourself up in and the matchup you're up against. I think 4 Elsas is warranted in this deck because, like I just mentioned earlier, you need as many rush targets as possible, and the tap down ability is very, very useful. The goal with blue-purple remains to be go as wide as possible. Yes, you're playing into board wipes like Be Prepared, like Big Sisu, but that's fine because, again, your goal is also, while I'm going wide, I'm developing a lot of resources in my hand so I can recover if my board does get wiped. Your goal is to overwhelm your opponent with a tempo-based, go wide strategy and still maintain card advantage, right? You should be able to challenge out opponent's threat, obviously, hence why we have so much cards focused on rush and boosting up strength in order to overcome, difficult stat lines on the opposing side. And that's why a deck like this can work. The tap down ability for the Elsa is extremely crucial, and one of the key things that you're going to need to use in order to bounce back to your hand, in order to keep replaying it and keep exerting opponent's threats when they're kind of in the ascendancy or with the tempo and you need to claw back tempo or switch tempo around. This card can definitely help you do that. Next up, we've got 3 Cuscos. Now, I don't think this card is, it's a good card, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary in every matchup, and for the most part it's going to be ink in a lot of matchups. What I do think is you definitely want to play at least 2, because at the very least you can search this out with the Merlin and play it the following turn most likely, but you absolutely need this in order to instantly deal with Queen's Castle and other locations that might become a problem, and certain items, mainly Lucky Dimes in the Sapphire Steel and Sapphire Ruby decks, where this card can single-handedly win you games against those decks. Well, I shouldn't say that, but like it provides you such an advantage putting that dime into their inkwell, because they can't get it back with a Tamatoa if it's in the discard, right? Or if it's in the inkwell and not in the discard, I should say. So a card like this is very, very strong in that certain matchup. Again, in other matchups, it's going to be completely useless and you're just going to ink it. But again, it is inkable, so there is that. And then we kind of have the card the deck is based around. You have, I think, a total of 10 shift targets in the 4 goat, 4 rabbit, and 2 crabs. I don't think you need to play more than that necessarily, because again, with the bounce package, if you shift this and you're able to bounce it back to hand, which, you know, you can definitely do depending on what your inkwell is looking like. If you're on like 7, 8 ink, you can always search out a Mim card and play it in the same turn to bounce back the 2 Merlins, right? The one that they shifted on and this card itself, and just continue to generate card advantage through the tutoring ability of the shift, right? So there's a lot of interesting synergies, right? Obviously, you know, you shift this, you quest with it, you shift this, you search, you quest with it, then you bounce it back. Like, there's a lot of cool things you can do here, obviously. But yeah, this is a toolbox deck, right? You shift this out, you search for the answer that you need in order to answer your opponent's threats, which could be, you know, the smaller Elsa, the bigger Elsa that we play here, which is played in 2. I think this card is very powerful, and in general, this coming down, tapping down your opponent's threat on the following turn, because likely when you shift the Merlin, you don't play this in the same turn, and then it can quest for 3, very powerful. Or you're looking to close out the game, you drop something like this Mufasa, and it's a great dime target. It's a very hard body to out. Again, it's going to depend on the situation. You're going to search out exactly what you need. In the gameplay video that I have coming, I think I ended up searching out a Let It Go to out a pretty big threat on my opponent's side. And because I searched it, of course, I could sing it right away with the Merlin, right? So this represents instant removal, where you just search the card you need and you just sing it right away. And I think songs are the best use of the tutoring ability, especially songs that cost 6 or less or can be sung together. Because again, when you shift the Merlin and you search for that song, you can just use it right away or sing with it right away. Speaking of which, you know, not that you'd really want to search friends on the other side, but this of course is just another draw engine, usable with many cards in the deck, of course. And then one of the cards you definitely can search is Second Star to the right, where, you know, if you have another 4 cost or, you know, another combination of 4 cost cards on board, you search this out with Merlin, you exert the Merlin and those other characters or one other character to just draw 5 cards immediately, which then, you know, on the following turn, you're just going to go off and probably play a number of different multiple interactions in a turn. So pretty strong stuff. Again, just a one of, because it is going to be a brick in your hand if you do end up seeing it and you don't search it. But definitely in certain scenarios, right, when you go wide enough, you can definitely just sing this together, even if you do hard draw it and you don't need to search it out. And then for the items, because you do play so much card draw, I thought 3 should be enough. I don't think you need to go with 4, but it is actually pretty strong when you do eventually see this, hopefully relatively close to the early part of the game where you can really start generating a ton of advantage off of this card. It really does like just shotgun you into like just insane amounts of advantage early on if you do just constantly start inking every turn with this, because if you also ink for turn, you're just going to ramp up so much. No fishbone, and we are on 17 uninkables, but I think this is fine. And because we're not playing any Mickeys or Donalds, the cards that ramp from your deck, I don't think you need to play more than 1 lucky dime, because again, this is a target that you're going to search out with the Merlin and probably develop next turn in order to start diming your targets for additional lore. And again, because you have the Greystone Dragon hopefully up by then, you're going to be able to dime and still play multiple interactions in a turn. Ideally, the dime targets, of course, are going to be like Cusco if you needed to play it, the Merlin shift itself, the Elsa, or the Mufasa. But, you know, diming for even 1 lore is decent enough. But what I would say is if you wanted to put in maybe somewhere from 1 to 5, and well, probably 1 to 4, another like 2 or 3 quester in order to get more value off dime, I think you can definitely do that as well. No Hiram engine, no focus on items, no popsicles, nothing like that, no Tamatoas. This is a Merlin toolbox deck. And yeah, like the Mufasa, you could argue you could play more copies of, but being uninkable and not playing Fishbone Quill, I think is a bit of a liability. But this card in the deck theoretically could just absolutely go insane, right? Because if you're inking off Stone Dragon, especially if you start inking good, like, you know, really expensive characters that was outed or discarded from your hand, and then you get those characters back to your hand, just imagine like Mufasa lives, you know, you play out a couple of interactions because you have a large inkwell already thanks to the Stone Dragon by the time you play Mufasa, and then you quest with it, you gain 4 lore, you ready up everything, and then you're just replaying what you got back from your inkwell. So this is one of the cards in this deck with the Greystone Dragon. In theory, again, on paper, seems to work pretty well because, you know, while you're inking stuff and you don't necessarily want to get that ink back to hand because you need the ink, like, because you're inking potentially twice a turn for multiple different turns, getting 2 cards back just represents pure card advantage. So if anything, you know, playing more of this would be nice, but I do think the reactive cards in like the Elsa Spirit of Winter is more valuable, just because you do need to react to your opponent's board. Like the Mufasa could be seen as win more, but not really. The Elsa, I think, is just generally more valuable. So that's going to do it for the deck profile. The gameplay video will come a little bit later, but let me know what you think. If you made it this far in the video, thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.